The war between Ukraine and Russia is starting to escalate. Ukrainian forces have managed to breach the southern defenses of the Russian army, using only a few brigades and long-range missiles. This was a small-scale attack, not an all-out assault. However, it was enough to disrupt the entire order of the invading Russian army in Ukraine. In this offensive, Ukrainian forces used Storm Shadow ballistic missiles, tactical UAVs, and partisans as a leading force, especially in Russian cities on the Black Sea and Azov Sea coasts, and along the Ukrainian border. Russian military assets and critical logistics lines were successfully destroyed by missiles and partisan operations. As it is known, cutting off the enemy's logistics is a classic strategy. Attacks on logistics lines cripple armies. This is how Ukraine managed to cripple the Russian army with its long-range missile attacks and partisan operations. The targets of these attacks were Russian railways and ammunition depots. The Russian army in Melitopol, Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Crimea went completely on the defensive but was unable to stop neither the Ukrainian missiles nor the partisans. The partisans responsible for many explosions and assassinations have continued to attack Russian supply lines in Crimea since the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive the other day. Ukrainian partisans blew up another railway in Crimea. According to preliminary information, the explosion occurred last night in a section of the railway near Feodosia. As a result of the explosion, the Russian supply train passing there blew up with the ammunition inside. A large crater was opened in the railway bed. The Kremlin-appointed head of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, confirmed the rail attack near Feodosia and the destruction of the Russian supply train. According to Aksyonov, about 20 Russian soldiers on the train lost their lives. Most of the rest were taken to hospitals in Crimea with serious injuries. Aksyonov also stated that there was very serious damage to the railway and services would be interrupted for 1 month. And buses would be removed for passengers from Feodosia and Vladislavovka stations. The Russian Defense Ministry did not comment on the matter. The Ukrainian Chief of Staff reported that the attack was carried out by Ukrainian partisans and that the supply train contained a large number of artillery and Kalashnikov shells. He reported that all these ammunition became unusable and 25 Russian soldiers died, according to initial determinations. Ukraine's Chief of the General Staff also praised the partisans who carried out the attack and stated that they would work to award them all medals of honor at the end of the war. The offensive actions of the Ukrainian partisan groups greatly influenced the course of the Ukrainian war. The actions carried out both in Ukraine and in the mainland of Russia made a lot of noise. These actions appeared not only as bomb attacks against Russian elements but also as assassinations from time to time. Earlier this week, partisans blew up the railway bridge near the occupied Melitopol. Russian troops used the bridge in the town of Yakimivka to supply weapons from Crimea. It was noted that the bridge serves as part of the arms supply artery from Crimea to the Zaporizhia region. The exiled mayor Ivan Fedorov said that the explosion blocked an important Russian logistics route near occupied Melitopol in Zaporizhia Oblast. According to Ivan Fedorov, Russian forces lost 5 freight cars and a 50-meter railway line as a result of the explosions. Fedorov reported that the explosion occurred at the most opportune moment when a train carrying stolen ore was on the track. Also in May, a freight train derailed in the Bryansk region as a result of an explosion. A locomotive and about 20 wagons were derailed. Earlier, a Russian freight train from Belarus was attacked as it passed through the Bryansk region. About 96 kilometers east of the Ukrainian border, 8 of the train's 78 wagons were derailed. As can be seen, explosions occur regularly in the occupied territories, while local Ukrainian partisan movements target Russian authorities, collaborators, and Russian military equipment. While Moscow generally blames Ukraine for such incidents, Kiev does not take responsibility for the explosions. Since the beginning of the Ukrainian war, partisans have eliminated exactly 50 senior Russian military officials appointed by the Kremlin. Apart from these oil and gas facilities, government buildings, and factories in Russia were blown up by Ukrainian partisan groups. These attacks inflicted great losses on the Kremlin. The Kremlin, both economically and politically worn out, did its best to silence the partisan groups but failed. However, the actions of the partisans that made the most noise and affected the course of the war took place with actions against the Russian supply routes. While in some of these actions, the partisans were directly involved, They sometimes coordinated with the army and helped the army get the job done. The partisans blew up the Russian supply routes, weakening the Russian defense, especially in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. Looking at the course of the counterattack, the fact that Ukraine has made the most gains in these regions is the biggest proof of the dire situation of the Russian army. In addition, in the past few days, while the Russian army was unloading ammunition, the military train that brought the ammunition was attacked by the Ukrainian armed forces. The attack took place in Rakov, which is located in the Kherson region and is under Russian control. Regional officials appointed by Russia reported that early yesterday, strong explosions occurred in the Russian-controlled settlement of Rakov in the Kherson region, and then a train carrying ammunition belonging to the Russian army was hit. Civilians in the region posted many videos of the explosion on social media. The explosion information was also confirmed by Petro Andriushenko, an advisor to the mayor of Mariupol. The attack on the Russian military installation took place around 4 a.m., Andriushenko said. They are on their way to the grain elevator area. Judging by the reports from the local population, there was a large arsenal of ammunition belonging to our army there. The explosion started right there. Local people said that they heard the sounds of the clashes a few hours after the explosions. The Ukrainian General Staff Bank also announced that a train belonging to the Russian army was attacked during the unloading of ammunition at the partisan station. The chief of the General Staff said in a statement that a large number of dead were among the Russian troops loading Rakov, which is about 120 kilometers from the areas controlled by the Ukrainian army. Therefore, it can be assumed that the Ukrainians used Storm Shadow missiles to hit the Russian military installation. Ukraine's chief of staff has yet to provide an update on how the attack took place. So what is the situation elsewhere? The attacks of the Ukrainian army on the Russian-controlled side of Kherson did not end there. In the past day, powerful explosions were heard in several settlements temporarily under Russian control in the Kherson region, on the coast of the Black and Azov Seas. Ukrainian military officials reported explosions at warehouses and bases of Russian troops. Loud explosions were heard in the Russian-controlled city of Henichesk in the Kherson region. According to eyewitnesses, the explosion occurred in the Russian army's ammunition depot in the suburbs. Russian social media users made comments on the issue by posting images from the region. The information was confirmed by Petro Andriushenko, an advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, appointed by the Kremlin. A Russian ammunition depot near Henichesk was hit by Ukrainian missile and artillery units, according to local residents. There was a large ammunition depot belonging to the Russian army in the area. The attack, which started with the attacks of the Ukrainian army against the warehouse in Rakov, resulted in the complete destruction of the ammunition warehouse and the death or injury of many Russian soldiers. Serhiy Starnino, a pro-Ukrainian activist in the region, noted that the attack was a direct hit. The explosions lasted for several hours and could be heard from far away. Later, explosions were reported in Skidovsk and at Russian bases in the Kherson region, also in the urban-type settlement of the Kherson region, Henichesk. There have been explosions for several hours, and smoke rises into the air. According to preliminary data, a hit was recorded in a large warehouse with ammunition. The Southern Operations Center of Ukraine reported that the explosions in Henichesk were very intense. These explosions lasted for 2 hours but occurred well beyond residential areas. After the blast ceased, clashes broke out between Russian troops and Ukrainian forces. Ukraine's Southern Operations Center reported that 150 Russian soldiers were killed or injured as a result of this conflict. Under the attacks of the Ukrainian army, especially on the southern front, there is a dream to take Crimea out of Russian control and turn the historical peninsula back into Ukrainian territory. Given the current progress of the Ukrainian army in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, it would not be wrong to say that this will be possible in the near future. The Kherson and Zaporizhia regions are seen as land bridges connecting Crimea and Ukraine, in particular, the city of Mariupol, which will provide the Ukrainian army with the necessary geographical advantage to recapture Crimea. With the Ukrainian army breaking through the Russian defense lines, it's very close to Mariupol and should not be surprising that it will liberate this place soon. In this way, Ukraine will be able to achieve the victory it expects as soon as possible and perhaps put an end to this fierce war. Russian forts were easily detonated by targeting the arsenals in them. Hundreds of Russian soldiers in the forts lost their lives. The Russian Defense Ministry did not comment on the incident. In addition to the loss of Russian strongholds, Ukrainian forces also destroyed 5 Russian Ural trucks. Ural trucks served as chassis for transporting Russian soldiers or long-barreled guns. The loss of the Russian army in the Kupiansk region directly affects the invasion plan throughout Ukraine. Let's look at how the Russian formation in Kupiansk affected other fronts. Looking at the active war map, we come across a front line dividing eastern Ukraine from north to south. 80% of the Russian forces are located east of the eastern Ukraine. Frontline Kupiansk is located in the northernmost part of this front line. For this reason, we can describe Kupiansk as a pole. Kupiansk was a major contributor to the Russian forces' invasion plan in Ukraine. If the Russian forces in Kupiansk advance in the direction of Izium, they may seize the only supply route of the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. Russian forces have surrounded the Ukrainian forces, defending Bakhmut, capturing half of the city and key locations such as Soledar. Despite this, the Ukrainian forces are determined not to leave the Bakhmut defense, and the road, which is the only support route to Bakhmut, is of great importance for the Ukrainian forces in this context. Russian forces want Bakhmut. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has set 31st of March as the deadline for his army for the occupation of Bakhmut. Although this time was approaching, the Russian troops were not able to gain the advantage to fully control Bakhmut. More than 70,000 people lived in Bakhmut before the war. However, the number of civilians residing there nowadays is less than 5,000. This is the biggest indicator of the damage done to Bakhmut by the Russian forces. But the Kremlin government and the Russian army suffered more than the city suffered in the Battle of Bakhmut. In the battle to capture Bakhmut, between 20 to 30 Russian soldiers were neutralized by Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian officials said about 30 of the 50,000 soldiers of the Wagner Group, who commanded offensive operations in Russia's Donetsk region, deserted or were killed or wounded. The vast majority of them in and around Bakhmut. Despite the huge and serious loss of troops, Russia has gained some 60 kilometers squared around Bakhmut and the nearby town of Soledar since the beginning of the fighting. This has led to questioning whether the Kremlin government has been successful over and over again. Despite the heavy losses in the Bakhmut region, the Russian forces continued to pile up large numbers of soldiers and equipment in the region. The Kremlin government is trying to destroy the greater Ukraine defense by sending more troops. But the Russian army's success rate in Bakhmut is only 1%. Russia is more advantageous in terms of military manpower, so why can't they be successful against the Ukrainian forces? The Kremlin has vowed to fight for as long as it takes. In recent days, the Battle of Bakhmut has turned into a simple test of endurance, and Russia has already suffered mind-blowing losses. For the time being, Ukraine continues to defend the Bakhmut region with advanced weapons from the West. But if Russian leader Vladimir Putin is willing to accept any number of Russian casualties to achieve his goal in the region, the situation in the Bakhmut region may be different. The Ukrainian commander recently expressed concern that Russia has an infinite number of men to mobilize its army. In this context, let's not forget the goal of Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to increase the total number of soldiers in the Russian army from 1.1 million to 1.5. However, the Kremlin government also has a limit on this matter. Even if Russian forces capture the city of Bakhmut, these gains would come at a surprisingly heavy price. Ukrainian forces do not want to surrender the city without dealing a major blow to the Russians. NATO stated that the Russians lost as many as 2,000 men for every 100 yards of land they gained. Russian forces have adopted an all-out war strategy, and this strategy requires having a large number of soldiers. The emergence of a new wave of mobilization within Russia was an issue previously reported by Ukrainian intelligence. Ukraine's military intelligence service estimated earlier this year that Russia would likely order a new mobilization of 500,000 in January. However, even though we almost finished March, this did not happen. But there's an expectation that there will be a mobilization again in Russia. Only the time is not clear. The Kremlin government's reluctance to call for a new mobilization is for predictable reasons. Mobilization in September caused more Russians to flee the country than those who actually went to fight in Ukraine. Furthermore, they provoked some of the largest anti-war protests since the start of the war. When this has been the case, the announcement of a new mobilization raises political concerns in the Kremlin. The mobilization decree made the Russians see directly that they were very badly governed. It has proven to all Russians that the Kremlin government is grossly incompetent. However, we still have doubts about one thing. The Russian government knows that it will attract all the reactions with the new mobilization wave. We think that the Kremlin government has quietly started a new mobilization wave in order not to repeat the events again. And in this context, people who continue their civilian lives are forcibly recruited into the military. Russia aims to prevent major reactions by carrying out its activities related to mobilization in regions far from the center where ethnic minorities live. As long as the war continues in Bakhmut, new moves will continue to occur. While the Ukrainian forces continue to defend the region with modern weapons, the Russian troops are carrying out their attacks without hesitation. Ukrainian forces did not fire at soldiers alone. However, the Russian soldier had to flee from the fire of his own forces before reaching the Ukrainian positions to be taken prisoner. The march of the Russian soldier was accompanied by Ukrainian infantrymen and scouts. After the march, the soldier reached the Ukrainian positions. Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Mikhailo Fedorov said that the soldier is currently in custody. In addition, the surrender of a soldier in Bakhmut easily revealed the situation of the Russian army. One person surrendered yesterday. However, this was a phenomenon that we were not unfamiliar with. According to the reports of the Ukrainian authorities, 3,200 Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces in March. More than 4,500 Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces in April. According to Vitaly Matvienko, the number of Russian applications increased by 10% from March to April. In May, this rate increased even more. The main reason for the increase in the number of Russian applicants who wanted to surrender was that Ukraine's counterattack could start at any time. The Russians, who did not ignore this possibility, resort to the compassionate project of Ukraine to save their lives. We've talked about this project at the beginning of the video. Let's take a closer look at this project called I Want to Live. This project was implemented by the Kiev administration last September for the surrender of the Russian soldiers. Russian soldiers who call this line or send messages via correspondence applications can arrange the best and safest method for them to surrender. The head of the Ukraine hotline, Vitaly Matvienko, noted that the calls came mainly from the Moscow and Leningrad regions, as well as Chelyabinsk, Novgorod, and occupied Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. Vitaly Matvienko announced that more than 20,000 Russian applicants have surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces through the project since the beginning of September. In addition, Ukraine has released an instructional video on how to surrender to a UAV in order to provide more guidance to the Russians who want to surrender. The Ukrainian army has released an instructional video for Russian soldiers with a step-by-step guide on how to surrender to one of the drones. The video comes as part of Ukraine's I Want to Live project, a hotline that encourages Russians who don't want to fight in Ukraine to surrender. Soldiers who surrender are instructed to call the I Want to Live hotline to prearrange the time and place of the meeting. After the location of the soldiers are verified, the soldiers must go to the specified place at the exact time specified. Once the soldiers are in place, they should wait for the drone to appear. If the drone has not appeared, soldiers should wait for further instructions. When the soldiers see the UAV in the field of view, they have to make eye contact with it. Soldiers must then raise their arms and signal that they are ready to follow. After that, the drone will move up and down a few meters before moving at walking speed towards the closest representatives of the Ukrainian army. Finally, the drone will liberate the Russian soldiers who want to surrender. Ukraine wants to prove that salvation is so easy and close with a video. It's published while the Kiev administration makes life easier for Russians who do not want to fight for Putin. It also gains a number of successes on the front lines. Russian forces in and around Bakhmut began to retreat after a series of local Ukrainian counterattacks. Ukrainian forces are starting to gain momentum. However, it's unlikely that Kiev will launch a large-scale counteroffensive. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has just announced that they will have to postpone the offensive operation because they are not ready yet. Earlier this week, Russian troops began withdrawing from their positions in and around Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces are pressing hard, using artillery and mechanized infantry to liberate the land. According to satellite images, Ukrainian forces liberated at least half a mile in its latest estimate of the war. UK Ministry Intelligence noted that the zone had some tactical significance to the UK. This was a Russian bridgehead on the west bank of the Donetsk-Donbass Canal, which marks the front line in parts of the sector. The 72nd Separate Motor Rifle Brigade of the Russian Army became one of the units that lost ground. British military intelligence reported that the 72nd Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, a fairly new unit formed in the autumn, suffered heavy losses and was plagued by demoralization in the fighting in Donbass. UK military intelligence stated that the deployment of the 72nd Separate Motor Rifle Brigade in such a challenging and operationally important sector demonstrates Russia's serious lack of combat units. Ukrainian forces currently hold a quarter of Bakhmut, but any progress that forces the Russian forces to withdraw bodes well. Russian commanders also have to fear the morale of their troops. The long war failures and extremely heavy losses created the perfect cocktail for disobedience in the Russian ranks. The Russian army must be careful that the retreat does not turn into a rout. Ukrainian counterattacks show that Russian forces are far from taking the town. The fight for Bakhmut will soon reach the one-year mark, and this is by far the most fierce battle of the war. Meanwhile, Russian forces continue to suffer significant losses on land in Ukraine. In the last 24 hours, the Russian aerospace forces have suffered heavy losses. Reports from the ground indicate that the Russian army has lost a Su-35 flanker fighter jet, a Su-34 full-back fighter bomber, and two Mi-8 HIP transport helicopters in the Ukrainian province of Bryansk in northeastern Ukraine.